We are at Hamtopia, Bevy talking to you. It is the 14th of April, and it's a Tuesday. Reaper and the Scribe, chapter 24. Sit back and enjoy the ride, folks. In the 19th century, things were moving along at a pace. John Winters had overseen several trials of the stern section of Albert Winter's boat Lightning performed whilst in the water. Each test of the engine and propeller system had worked well, and the new forward bulkhead and riveting were waterproof. The engine and boiler had performed beautifully. The bearings and the watertight seals were working at optimum levels, and the young man running the engine did the job effortlessly. Now that both sections of the boat were back in dry dock, work had begun on the living quarters that would take up the forward section of the stern not being used for the engine. The stern was now sectioned into two separate parts. The rear was the engine room, and the forward section was to be the new living quarters. A bulkhead had been placed between the two rooms, and both sections had separate entrances, so the two were fully separated for safety reasons. Everything that James needed was fixed into the engine room. The coal stash complete with its own loading chute, the boiler and engine, the water tank with an inlet fixed to the outside of the boat, and an old armchair. A small toolbox and shovel, oil cans, and a can of grease made up everything that James would need for the effortless working of the steam engine. The living quarters were at least twice the size of the original galley. The living and cooking area were about the same, but now there was a separate bedroom area with two bunks divided by a curtain. Doris's old wood stove had been replaced with a new one, and again the stove was twice the size of the old one. Because the seating area didn't have to be altered to become the beds, a table with comfortable seating around it was introduced. As the two compartments were finished, the newly made deck section was being riveted into place. Much thought had gone into the placing of the steering gear. Some back at the factory thought it would be better for the steering to be at the bow section, but unlike John Winters, the people that thought that were not boat people and didn't understand the mindset as such. John knew that his father or any boatman would want to be looking out onto all the boat and not having to keep looking behind. So the decision was made that the steering would be at the back where the rudder was housed. That would eliminate intricate wiring having to pass down the side of each separate hold in between the bow and stern, and the steering would have a more direct feel. The main difference to the steering would be using a wheel instead of the tiller. As the deck was riveted into place, a team of workmen fitted the beautifully carved steering wheel onto its pedestal. John Winters walked behind the stern and asked for the wheel to be turned full to port and then full to starboard. As with everything else, the rudder moved effortlessly, both to the left and to the right. The fettling was done. The last rivet had been fitted, and the stern section of Lightning was being painted. After several coats of paint had dried, the two name boards with the words Albert Winters and Daughter were proudly placed on the port and starboard sides. As the workers moved onto the bow section, 3 midsection holds arrived via the canal. They were the same color as the completed stern section of Albert Winter's boat. They caused quite a stir, as they had been towed down the canal, and not everyone understood what they were. One man, however, saw them, as they passed under Leeds Bridge, an elegant gentleman who was intrigued by them and wanted to know more. He wrote a few notes on a small notepad that he had about his person. He noticed on the tarpaulins covering the tops of the strange oblong vessels the words "Property of Mr. John Winters, Leeds." The man made sure to take note of that name before he made his way over the bridge. The bow section was a much easier build, with the main bulkhead in place. All that was needed was to clean the interior and make it a hold large enough to store enough coal to keep it low in the water. The bow would become part of the steering mechanism once it was linked to the steering wheel. As the rudder was sent to port, then so would be the bow, making turning that bit easier with the extended length of the new vessel. This was achieved by strong wires running through loops all the way down the port and starboard sides of the vessel. The linkages at the bow and stern would easily undo by the turning of a hand screw on a link at both ends. This was for when the vessel had to be separated to go through the lock systems. On the rear bulkhead of the bow, just like on the forward bulkhead of the stern, large half-looped pieces of 2-inch thick bar steel had been put in place. Similar linkages had been placed on all the separate holds, fore and aft. On the rear part of the bow and the rears of all the separate holds was fitted a split link that could be hooked onto the next part of the vessel. Once the link was in place, a sleeve screwed onto the bottom part of the link, making it complete again. John Winters now surveyed the finished work, as the dry dock had been flooded, and both sections of the once complete boat floated out and were married to the 3 separate holds. The finished vessel looked impressive. In John's eyes, it was the marvel of its time, but there was no time to stand and admire his work. John knew there was one person that he had to impress, albeit for a very brief time, and that was his father, Albert Winters. He had sent young James to bring the family down to Leeds Dock to be reunited with their boat. It wasn't long before Albert, Doris, and Alice, with her son Frederick, arrived at the scene. Albert could not believe his eyes when he cast them over his vessel. For a moment he was speechless. Doris and everyone else took their eyes from the boat to see what Albert's reaction was. Albert slipped his fingers under his cap to scratch his head. He then took out his pipe and fired it up. He took a large toke of his pipe and exhaled a cloud of smoke. With the hand that held his pipe, he pointed at the impressive vessel and said, "Have you designed and built this, John?" "With the help of these men, yes, I have." "And Alice, is this the future you talked about?" John and Alice looked at each other, and Alice said, "It is most certainly the beginning of it, Father." "And Doris, what do you think?" "I think you should stop mithering so that I can go and see inside," said an impatient Doris. Albert gave a hearty laugh and said, "I can't remember when I was last this bursting with pride. John, you have proven to me that your decision to leave all those years ago was the right one. If this works, it will transform the movement of coal. Now then, let's go see if it looks as good below deck." Doris made straight for the front section of the stern, as she had been told it was the entrance to the cabin. "I guess we're looking at the cabin first," said Albert as a smile came to his mouth. The family followed Doris down into the cabin. What Doris saw stopped her and everybody else in their tracks. The sheer size of Doris's new home was hard for her to take in. "How can I turn these seats into beds with this table here?" asked Doris. "Look through that door, Mother," said John. Doris did as she was told and opened the door. Tears welled up in her eyes, as for the first time in their married life she had a bedroom, and more to the point, a bedroom separated from her children's. "Albert, look at this! We don't have to make a bed any more. There is already one here," said Doris. "Aye, lass, the lad has done us proud. We will leave you to acclimatize to your new space, Mother. Dad, Alice, come with me." John took his father and his sister topside and motioned them to follow him to the rear of the stern. Once at the back, he told his father to place his hands on the wheel. Albert did as he was told and stood behind the wheel looking every bit the captain of the vessel. Albert noticed something that looked like a tube with a funnel on the end of it and said, "What's this for, John?" "Put your mouth to it and shout for James. Then put your ear to it." Albert looked puzzled, but he did as his son asked, and into the flared end of the tube he shouted to his son James and placed his ear into the funnel. "Aye, Captain," is what Albert heard as he quickly stepped back with an astonished look on his face. "I heard young James coming out that tube," said a shocked Albert. "Of course you did, Father. That is your connection to the engine room, where James awaits your arrival." This was getting more and more exciting for Albert. He had all but forgotten that he was an old stick in the mud and didn't really want to move forward. He embraced the technology of the new age as he pushed by everyone to race down to where his youngest son James was proudly standing by his shining engine, a large smile gracing his face. "I could hear you in that tube up on deck, James." "I know, Dad. I could hear you down here. Isn't John clever?" "So, this is where you will be working, is it, lad?" said the proud father. "Indeed it is. As I learn more and more about how to run the steam engine through the day with you, at night I'm going to be learning all kinds of new things with John." "Well, you make sure you listen to John, because as we can all see, he is a master craftsman." Alice placed her arm around James and said, "John has made it so our future can happen. Are you ready to take on all that entails?" "I feel I could take on the world, Alice. This is what we've been working towards, and I am ready." Albert looked thoughtful as he rubbed his chin. He looked at his youngest son standing proudly at the side of the steam engine. He looked at his eldest son with pride, and then looked at his daughter. Albert smiled and said, "There's only one thing wrong with this boat." John looked puzzled and said, "What's that, Dad?" "Come topside and let's have Doris here, because I've got something to say." The whole party went up the steps and down onto the bank. Alice brought Doris, and they walked over to Albert. Doris slipped her arm into Albert's and said, "What's the matter, love?" Albert looked at his family and said, "The thing that is wrong with the boat is the nameplate. This boat is the future, and I am the past. I think the name needs changing to Alice Winters. Doris has reminded me that we have worked on this boat all our married life, and soon I should think about retiring. Well, I think this is a perfect time for me to say that it's time for me to quit. John, Alice, and James all looked at each other, not really knowing what to make of their father's decision. All is going to plan, except your father's resignation, as the retirement that he is about to have is well earned. Now you must press on and make him proud, said a reassuring female voice in both John and Alice's minds simultaneously. The one-time unworldly siblings looked at each other and gave each other a smile. They walked over to their father, and John shook his father's hand and said, "No one has earned this more than you, Father." Alice jumped up and wrapped her arms around her father's neck. She kissed him on the cheek and said softly in his ear, "I love you, Dad, and I won't let you down. Now that we have embraced this brave new world, there will be no stopping us. You and Ma'am will live your lives as comfortable as a gentleman and a lady. We will make sure of that. Trust John and I in what we are about to undertake. We know that it's the right thing to do." Albert looked slightly puzzled, but totally trusted his two eldest children and vowed he would go with whatever they wanted to do. Doris threw her arms around her husband as he bent down for her to kiss his cheek. This wonderful family moment was enjoyed by all the family, the gathered workers and the engineer who had taught John Winters. One other was there, a stranger to John, but an acquaintance of his boss, Jack Hawkins. He had stood quite motionless and not spoken a word all the time he had been there, but now Jack Hawkins introduced his friend to John. "Tom, I would like to introduce you to the best apprentice I've ever trained. He came to me already quite knowledgeable, and now his abilities, as you can see in front of you, have far surpassed his tender age. John, this is my friend Tom. For now, we will keep it on a first-name basis, but Tom has an offer for you that will make you and your family's future assured." "Someone called Tom will want to buy your design," thought John, as he remembered back to the voice he'd heard in his room before all this started. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Tom. Be assured the pleasure is all mine, John. Now, gentlemen, as John is a superb engineer but knows little of business, I have arranged for him to have a meeting with my accountants so they can help him with his negotiations. I assume you have no objection to that, Tom? As you are both friends of mine, I want what's best for both of you," announced Jack Hawkins. "A fine gesture, sir, one I sincerely approve of. I am not in the business of being underhanded in any way," said the elegantly dressed gentleman. Alice squeezed John's hand as he said, "Thank you once again, Mr. Hawkins, and thank you, Mr. Tom. What do you call this arrangement of holds that you have come up with in this vessel?" asked Tom. Again, after thinking back to that night in his room, John said, "I haven't thought a name for it yet, but looking at the 3 holds in between the bow and stern, They remind me of Yorkshire pudding tins." Tom laughed and said, "Puddings? I like that. It has a certain ring to it. Do you mind if I use that analogy?" "Not at all," said John, with a smile on his face. That short conversation instigated one of the biggest transformations the air and Calder navigation had seen since it was built. The elegant gentleman raised his top hat and replaced it on his head, saying, "Good day, gentlemen. I look forward to doing business with you." Jack Hawkins and John Winters shook the man's hand as he departed. Jack turned to his friend John and said, "You have an appointment with Mr. Atkinson of Atkinson, and Dewhurst tomorrow at 10:30. It is an appointment you must not miss." "I have a large delivery of steel arriving tomorrow. I really should be there to oversee it." "You really must learn to delegate. Let the foreman do that. You just make sure that you make that appointment." "You're right. The foreman can do that. I will be at that appointment." With that, John Winters shook Jack Hawkins' hand and returned to his family, while Jack Hawkins walked away along the canal bank. Alice looked at John and whispered in his ear, "This could be the start of it." "This is the start of it. I know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. I even had to say that about the Yorkshire pudding tins. All this is preordained. I was told that this would happen, and tomorrow I will be made an offer that I can't refuse. I will be paid a vast amount of money. They will see mother and father live out their lives in a cottage without a care in the world. Enough for me to pay back the engineer everything I owe him and start again. We will be able to start your steam locomotive haulage business and take father's business into the next century." "Did the voice in your head tell you all this?" "Why do you ask that?" "Because I've been hearing her too, and she has told me everything that you just said that you will be doing for me." "This is all a bit scary. What are we dealing with here? When I think back, I don't even know how I got that job that started all of this. I still think it's magic, and it will all happen just how we have been shown, so let's just go with it for now. The future is in our hands. Let's not fight it." "You're right, sis. Let's see what tomorrow brings." Now the ceremony was over. Albert and Doris had gone down into their new cabin. Albert was fidgeting on his chair again, and Doris was looking at the new stove. "Is it just me, or does this room feel strange all of a sudden? It's almost like it's not ours," said Doris. "I can't get comfortable on this seat, Doris, and that's silly because it's my same chair. Maybe you feel different when you retire." "Oh, Albert, you are daft. Of course it doesn't feel any different. It's just the newness and the excitement of the day, that's all." "But something is happening," reassured Doris. At that point, Alice came downstairs, carrying little Frederick. She had heard the conversation, and with a smile on her face said, "Retirement will be good for you, and I have a feeling it will not be spent in the confines of this room. Remember that trip to the seaside that you never got? Well, tomorrow John is going to be dealing with that, and very shortly you'll both be seeing the sea. And I don't mean the sea at Liverpool or Hull. I mean a proper week away at the seaside. The future is going to be bright. You just wait and see." "I'm glad you brought the future up. We're going to have to talk about that little lad of yours," said Albert. "What do you mean?" "You're going to have a lot of work to do, young lady." now that I won't be here? And where are you going to find the time to look after the infant?" Alice looked shocked, and for the first time she considered the work ahead and said, "Dad, how awful! I hadn't even thought of motherhood." "Listen very carefully to what your father is about to say. What he says makes perfect sense, and that boy of yours needs to grow strong so he can take over for you when the time comes. Now is not the time for sentiment. You have been very lucky in this day and age to have one child and see that child grow strong. Your need of the child in the future is greater than the child's need of you now." The voice in Alice's head diminished as her father began to speak. Alice, slightly dazed, heard one or two of the important words her father was speaking, but she felt quite faint, as now she would be tested more than anything she had gone through in her entire life. She now knew that when her mother and father retired, motherhood for her would retire with them. "Well, lass, tell me your thoughts, because you know the lad would be better off with us," said Albert, after his monologue had ended. Alice knew there would be a price to pay. Everything had all gone too easily, and now the piper needed paying. At that point, Doris spoke. "If you are as committed to this future that you have been telling us about for the last 5 years, you have to think about that little one's future. There will be no one down here to play with him or teach him. He will spend much of his time alone, because the work you will be taking on with this much bigger boat means you'll be spending more time topside. And who's going to cook the lad's dinner? You will have no time, but while he is with us, he will grow up being well fed by me and educated by his granddad. He will grow big and strong, just like his granddad, as Albert teaches the lad everything he knows for when he is big enough to come back and join you. And come back he will." Alice looked at her mother and father and knew they were right. She also knew she had come too far with what she and her brother were doing. There was some guiding force making all the decisions, and this was clearly one of them. Alice walked into her parents' open arms and put her arms around them both. No more words were needed, as something passed between them in that intimate moment. Future events had to rule the way that Alice thought, and one of those future events would be the return of her beloved son Frederick to eventually carry the dream forward when the 20th century loomed. All the pieces were now in place for John to make ready to meet the strange accountants who resided within the old Tudor building with the names Atkinson, and Dewhurst above the door.